Yeah, whoops, looks like I'm even more late this year than I was last year. In all actuality, I think I'm fine with that, since I feel like this is always my most important video of the year. The one that really paints a picture of what I personally enjoy in music the absolute most. And I want to be goddamn thorough with it. And if that means taking several months past the end of the year to go through my backlog and really be absolutely certain of my picks, then so be it. And 2019 was a pretty good year for albums, at least for me. I'd say this crop trends slightly stronger than my 2018 favorites as a whole. I'm definitely cutting back from a longer list this year, whereas last year I only barely had a full 10 albums I felt like really deserved the elevation. Though I think this list is also going to paint a very clear picture of my changing taste in 2019, but we'll get to that as we go through. Anyways, let's cut to the chase. The only hard rules are that the albums on this list had to be released in 2019, and I had to hear them for the first time in 2019. And before the list proper, I'd like to just briefly touch on a handful of honorable mentions that I really liked, but didn't quite make my top 10, starting with this album, if I'm in the right mood for it, is just an excellent dose of groovy, crushing, hypnotic, and riff-laden post-metal. It's very consistently a headbanger and surprisingly atmospheric at times too. And it runs the full gamut of spacier psychedelia to hammering, relentless riffing across its 6 tracks, making for a dynamic and diverse listen, with only very brief stretches of the album I consider to be below par. But like I said, I have to be in the right mood for it to really hit hard. Otherwise, it's just pretty good. Always enjoyable, but not always a favorite. On the flip side, for something very accessible, borderline pop even, we have Capstan's debut album. Tasty and melodic guitar work, heavy but not overpowering riffs, and hooks for miles and miles, and the occasional post-hardcore screams, but they're used in moderation at most. I will say that, while I feel like all the songs in this album are consistently strong, this is an album I don't feel is as deep or listenable as a lot of the others on this list. And it does feel more like a collection of songs rather than an album experience, even if it does feel cohesive on the whole. Good fun if you're into the style though, and we'll always have Paris as an easy Song of the Year candidate. Ooh boy, I was worried about this one. Despite Somewhere Along the Highway being the single best post-metal album ever made, and no, I will not be taking feedback on this, I've never been too into any of their other albums, and so nearly 80 minutes of Cult of Luna sounded like the worst possible direction for them to go, but they somehow make it work by just turning in some of the best songs of their career. Not every track is gold, but they're all still good, and in terms of heavy but addictive riffing, a balance of both overpowering and more reflective atmospheres, and a surprising amount of diversity on top of a good front-to-back album flow. It's just the whole package, albeit one that could have still been tightened up a little. Ooh man, this album is in a weird place. It's a genre fusion I've never quite seen before. Some screamo, some black gaze, some technical death metal, a few sprinklings of post-metal, all meshed together so as to defy all those genres, but it's also weirdly nondescript. Every part of me says I should like this more than I do, and it's a shockingly listenable album front to back, yet I never come away remembering much of it or feeling that there was any particularly strong songs on it, yet I still want to keep listening to it anyways. It's intense, it's melodic, it's colorful, it's emotive, but it's not strongly any of those things either. I do feel like this one still has room to grow on me though, even now. This is the most tragic case here, because if you cut just the last track, this would have easily made the top 10 proper, and pretty dang high at that, too. This album is a stark exploration of the artist's bipolar disorder, featuring one half some of the most chaotic, dissonant, and immediately striking black metal of the year, contrasted with one very beautiful yet harrowing ambient track, and a second one that's, just too stagnant to really do much of anything for me. I get why it's that way, it makes sense in concept, but it makes the entire last third of the album feel like a bit of a drag. Still very highly recommend this one regardless though. The good stuff is really, really damn good. This one is here because a whole year after this album dropped and I really dug into it. I revisited preparing for this list and wow, I must have shelved this one way too early because there's just so much to dig into here. This is explicitly not an album for first-time Devin listeners though. It's very intentionally a comprehensive summary of a decades-long career spanning rock, metal, prog, new age, country, techno, pop, and classical. The last of those also being a potential look into the future if Devin's planned symphony ever does see the light of day. It's a monument to self-indulgence in the best way, and an album I can't confidently call a favorite just yet, due to its sheer scope making it hard to fully grasp, but one I enjoy plenty all the same. And going from the album that's largest in scope to the one that's easily the smallest. This is one of a pair of albums that I checked out much earlier in this year and didn't quite click with at first, but revisited at the end of the year and absolutely fell in love with. And yes, I'll get to the other on the list proper. How is it that this brief 32-minute whirlwind of violent, abrasive screamo and mathcore is so stuffed with memorable melodic hooks and raw emotive power? I really can't say. All I know is that I enjoy listening to it a lot more than I'd expect to, given the brevity of its tracks. But I think that speaks more to how well it functions as a whole than anything, harrowing and chaotic in the best ways. Really, this album only missed the list because a lot of what it does well, another album I heard in 2019 does just as well and does it for almost twice as long. And speaking of, let's kick off the list proper with I can succinctly explain the appeal of this album in just one short sentence. They're basically a Mexican The Hirsch Effect. The end. Next. Nah, that's not quite fair. There's definitely a number of distinctions to be drawn between the two, but a lot of the same core is there. Wild mathcore influences, favoring melody and hooks over mindless aggression, a willingness to experiment with the boundaries of their style, and a compelling album-long vision that ties it all together. I think the biggest and most obvious difference is that the Hirsch Effect sound tends to come off a bit more polished and sanitized, which, to be clear, I have absolutely no issue with. While Joliet sounded much more raw. The production is fairly lo-fi, the melodies tend towards angular and off-kilter, and there's a consistent energy running throughout the album, paced well enough that it never gets exhausting or overwhelming. Some tracks are standard and hook-centric, some are shorter bursts of aggressive energy, and others still take a patient groove and build it up to a roaring climax. It's a very dynamic and diverse listen the whole way through. That being said, I do feel it's not quite at the level of the best albums I've heard in this style. I can't really point to any one weak song, but I do think the back half of the record greatly outshines the front half. The run from Futuras Campanas to Senor Mora especially is a wonderful 20-minute stretch of music. I also feel the closer, Defenstra, runs a bit long and is a bit of an anticlimax compared to what came before. But again, it's still, good, and it's not like it's retreading ground already covered early on the album either. There's not much beyond nitpicking for me to do against this album though. It's just so vibrant and enthralling. The kind of music that really excites me, even if it lacks a strong emotional core. The first time I listened to this album, I could already tell it was going to grow to be one of my favorites, and having checked out the entire Joliet back catalog by now, yeah, they've pretty much always been this good, but this really does feel like the culmination of their sound up till now, and I'm very excited to see where they take their sound in the future. And in a similar vein of rather adventurous, immediately attention-grabbing albums, this is one of those albums that's like an everything bagel of sounds I love. The core sound is folk-leaning black gaze, but added to that are influences from progressive metal, post-hardcore, post-rock, and even a few sprinkles of jazz. While I wouldn't say no two tracks are alike, there's definitely a variety of styles on display here that on their own make this a compelling listen, and another that immediately piqued my interest. And And that's before getting to the fact that the songs themselves are just damn good. Like, almost immediately, Resurgence is a 7-minute cavalcade of strong riffs and melodic hooks, tied together with a few tempo and mood shifts. It's a great opener that presents an overture of what's to come. Other highlights include Echo Flower Part 2, a blackened post-hardcore track with a jazzy math rock instrumental in its back half, and the title track, which is very patient and beautiful but explodes into one hell of a climax, topped off with a lovely trumpet solo. The final Bastion immediately follows up with a rollicking and intense melodic black metal feel, a last hurrah before the quiet closer. And those are just the highlights. Again, it's hard to point to any really weak songs here, but I will say that the album does run a bit long at over 70 minutes. So the moments where the album does retread ground a little become all the more noticeable. The run of tracks 6 through 8 especially, which all feel like 3 different takes on a very similar sound, with the last of them, Canopsia, definitely executing it the best of the 3. I don't mind that there are 2 mostly clean, folky ballads on the album, however, since they're far enough apart so as not to feel redundant, and both are quite pretty to boot. Despite how long this runs, it never really does feel overly long though, even if the middle drags just a little bit. And with the diversity and quality on display, it makes for a good album experience front to back, as well as on a song-by-song basis. Musically, it's compelling and intriguing, and emotionally it resonates strongly. It's not my favorite version this year of any of its various elements, but it's still an enjoyable hybrid of them that I came back to time and time again, and it's one summit I'm always thrilled to climb whenever I get the chance. Of course, for an even more monolithic excess of prog, with much more overt jazz influences. Okay, for real, can I just skip this one? I already made a half-hour video on this band just a few months ago, and pretty much covered all my thoughts on this album in the process. Y'all already know why I love this band, and y'all already know why I feel this album isn't quite as strong as their others. It's overlong, the songs are too overstuffed with ideas and lack structure, it doesn't hit upon quite as many sticky hooks or compelling musical passages as their previous album, and it hardly feels like a progression of their sound from the last album. But it's like, still a Thank You Scientist album, you know? Everything I love about this band is still here, and it's not like there's any song here I think there's anything less than good. It's still a front-to-back, colorful and fun ride of progressive songwriting, jazz technicality, and pop catchiness. Yeah, some of the experiments don't quite work, and there's a lot that could be trimmed. Yeah, they don't match any of their previous highs at any point in this album, but I still love listening to it. I'll freely admit my first impressions of this one were probably also colored heavily by experiencing over half this album for the first time last spring at a live show. And God, what a show it was. They played damn near close to an hour of material from the new album. It was most of their set, and it was one of the best concert going experiences I've ever had. And the songs were all so instantly memorable that over a month later, when the album finally did drop, I was able to pick out pretty much every song they had played on my first listen through it. It may also be that, in a time where a lot of my old favorites have mostly been disappointing me recently, Leprous, Caligula's Horse, Intronaut, East of the Wall, even the Hirsch Effect of all bands, the fact that not only was this not a disappointment, but another great album, was more than enough to satisfy me. Again, I feel like I've said all I need to say about these guys in my top 12 video for them, so go check that video out if you still need to hear more. But for now, I'll leave it as saying that I can't wait for more from them. And if 84 minutes of progressive jazz rock seems a bit much to you, then let's shift gears to something much, much more compact and straightforward. Really, this album is more on the list as the strongest representative of a specific sound that I really got into in 2019, namely, the style of black metal that tries to evoke the bleakness of space. A sound that's built on 3 core pillars. First, the texture. It needs to sound massive, overwhelming, blurred enough so as not to be too sharp, but not too lo-fi either. Clear enough that the second pillar, the melody, comes through. Soaring motifs and an emotional core that provides the sound of its power. And third, and perhaps most important, the intensity intensity. If it doesn't pummel you over the head on at least a regular basis, then it's not going to hit as hard for me. Sure, it should be dynamic to some extent, but more than anything, I just want a soundscape that feels massive enough to get lost in. And ironically, the only weakness of this album, at least for me, is that it isn't massive enough at under 40 minutes in length and with only 4 tracks. Immense, monolithic 2-hour experiences have actually been more of my style when it comes to this brand of black metal, but on the flip side, that does allow for a conciseness that ensures no time on the album really feels wasted. The songs have a hypnotic sense of repetition to them, but are still constantly in motion, and each track is long enough to feel like a full journey. Not every track is that distinct from the others, but that doesn't really hurt the album in any way either. I did have other albums this year that hit upon some of the same notes for me. The relentlessness of Strige, which sounds like it's being played through a crack in the space-time continuum. The beautiful and majestic Olhava, with their very long-form and immersive pieces. The spaced-out and synth-led in Midnight Odyssey, whose 2011 album was a specific impetus for my increased interest in this sound. But none of those hit upon all 3 key factors of this style quite as well as some did this year. If this at all seems like your kind of sound, I'd absolutely recommend you check this out post-haste. And I'm definitely looking forward to a follow-up from them. Ideally one even more overwhelming, and especially longer. Please, I need more! But in terms of hitting the mark on a specific sound so well it elevates the entire album for me, there was another album this year that did just that for a completely different genre. The first thing about this album is that it just sounds fantastic. The guitars have a lot of weight and a lot of crunch, but not so much that it flattens out the melodies and the riffs or leads. The bass is mixed loud and has a very meaty sound to it, but not so loud that it drowns out the rest of the instruments either. The drums are all very well balanced. Snares, bass kicks, and hi-hats all come through cleanly, without clashing with each other or the rest of the instrumentation. Of every album I heard in 2019, this is easily the one that just sounds the absolute best. And that sound is put to great use on this slice of post-metal infused post-hardcore, taking the best aspects of each to create an atmospheric and riff-driven sound, with plenty of room for melody and hooks, and dynamic songwriting that keeps the album compelling the whole way through. It's hard to even pick individual standouts here. The entire album is just very consistent in its crushing potency. The vocals aren't too compelling by themselves, but their imperfect delivery pairs up well with the music accompanying them, that often feels like it's falling apart at the seams. If I could point to any weakness here, it's more to do with the album's structure. A lot of the most intense songs are front-loaded at the start, then the middle run of 3 tracks all follow the same quiet start, loud finale formula, with the last third kind of flipping back and forth between the calmer and more intense tracks. It leads to some weird pacing where the album can drag in the middle a bit, even if the songs themselves are all very strong nonetheless. It's really a minor nitpick at most though. The album's still a great front-to-back experience regardless. Post-hardcore played a big part in my 2019 music listening experience, and while this album is not quite as emotionally resonant as others yet to come on this list, it's still a very strong example of what the genre is capable of at its best. I got a lot more pleasure and replay value out of this one than I initially expected, and I really couldn't be happier about it. It's a great core sound with enough variety and fantastic execution to tie the whole package together. An absolute crusher each and every time. And yet, we've got 2 more post-hardcore records to go through, and next up might be the most devastating of the lot. And to think, the first time I heard this one, I nearly passed it up completely. I don't know, I think I grew into a place where this kind of stark and crushing post-hardcore was exactly what I wanted out of the genre. Is it fair to call this post-hardcore? I'd say yes, but it's almost entirely harsh screams rather than any balance of clean and harsh vocals. And I can't really make out most of the lyrics, which is frustrating when I also can't find the lyrics anywhere online. Even the CD didn't come with them. Come on guys, that's basic stuff. Regardless, even without lyrics, the emotional arc of this album is by far its most important aspect. The album has a 4-movement structure to it, the rising action in the first 3 tracks, culminating in the absolutely brutal ending of Bury Me. The next 2 tracks are more spacious and empty, Of Flowers in particular being utterly haunting in all the best ways. And the next 3 tracks have a noticeably more optimistic sound to them, even if the lyrics aren't any less bleak. Then the last arc, with the chaotic Remains feeling like it almost instantly crushes the optimism of the earlier tracks, leading to the uncertain resolution of Teach. And that's not even mentioning the handful of reprised motifs throughout the album. Even without knowing the words, the art comes through exceptionally well in just music alone.
Close to fame!
And the diversity on display here is impressive too. There's definitely a standard sound that runs through a fair number of tracks, but there's also elements of post-metal in Bury Me, the mostly acoustic Of Flowers, the post-rock and hardcore contrast of Hollow, and the relentless breakdown of Remains. The guitars play the largest role in the album, showing a surprising amount of flexibility, as well as driving most of the melodic hooks throughout. It can be a surprisingly catchy record at times, and I have to again give props to the absolutely harrowing vocals. Usually not my style, but they work here perfectly.
But the rebel inside my head always used to scream.
Sure, I could point to some minor gripes, like the occasional moment of slow pacing, or how the closer, Teach, doesn't quite feel satisfying, but I'd really be stretching for any critique past that point, because this album as a whole is just a very compact, tightly knit experience that I enjoy immensely front to back, and I'm so glad it didn't end up flying under my radar. Yet, there was one more post-hardcore project this year that really took its time to grow on me, and by the end of the year, it was undeniable just how gut-wrenchingly potent it was.
I felt afraid and ashamed, and I felt anything at all. I felt you panicking, your shattering, your catastrophic fall.
I've said it before, but I feel like the subject of death makes for the most emotionally compelling music, and this album tackles that subject well, both in confronting death directly and in how it impacts the lives of those affected by it. I could probably go on a long ramble about the subject matter and the lyrics, and we'd be here all day, but to summarize, the writing is very consistently compelling, and the vocals themselves absolutely sell the writing with a very passionate and dynamic performance, bouncing between subdued apathy, roaring rage, and everything in between across the album's 42-minute runtime.
Shuffling off to sleep, to places where you're hiding out the anger in your
But the vocals themselves wouldn't make any difference in the world if the music behind them wasn't strong enough to back them up, and the band really delivers on that front too. This is probably their lightest and least technical album to date, but that just lets the riffs hit harder when they come in, and turns the focus towards the melodies more than the sheer aggression found on their earlier albums. I especially dig the bass tone. It's got a very crisp and thick, but not overly polished sound, and is placed perfectly in the mix to always be plenty audible even alongside the roaring guitar climaxes.
Lifetimes lived and died for a moment in the turnaround. I was waiting in the car and drive, watched you hurry on across the parking lot.
But really, talking about the vocals and the instruments separately is almost doing the album a disservice, because how they interact is what really makes this work for me. The loudest moments have vocals complementing the rhythm of the riffs and making for surprisingly sticky hooks, while the most spacious moments of the album, like in Northern Michigan or You Ascendant, feature a more rambling spoken word style of delivery. The cadence of the vocals, contrasting or complementing with the rhythm of the music, is just as compelling as the album's emotional core, and it's what kept me coming back to this one more than anything else.
And I saw beams fighting bodies in the tree line off the interstate, but I've never put flowers by the string.
Admittedly, this album underwhelmed me at first. Nothing on the album ever quite lives up to the promise of Fulton Street 1, but it's all still really damn potent, and regardless, I grew to love it over the course of the year. It's probably the album most responsible for dictating my taste in post-hardcore this year too, and I definitely feel like it's their strongest effort to date, the crowning achievement of a band already drowning in accolade, and an album they definitely should be proud of. And thus ends our post-hardcore detour. The only way to follow it up? How about the only album that well and truly blew my mind on first listen this year? Seriously, the first time I listened to this, I was just immediately floored. I didn't have any expectations going into it, so a nearly 75-minute monolith of dense, brutal, and dynamic progressive death metal that constantly surprised me and kept me hooked the whole way through was quite a delight to find. And just how twisted and unique this is, how tightly woven the entire package feels, just how much there is to take in, still impresses me even a year later. Of every album on this list, this is the one that still feels most unfamiliar to me, despite having at least 24 listens to it by this point. It's just a lot, man. And make no mistake, this album is heavy, more so than I usually prefer, much like Monotheist from last year. The riffs are pummeling, with a massive guitar sound to match them, and while the riffs sometimes forsake melody for the sake of rhythm, there's still plenty of guitar leads to balance things out before it gets too overwhelming or monotone. The bass and drumming definitely play second fiddle to the guitar, but both have a great sound and power to them all the same. And that's just discussing the metal of this album, which is only half the fun. Every song is interspersed with quieter moments, whether it be opathy acoustic folk, a jazzier interlude or two, or even the chilling piano ambience of Old Friend, which, for the record, is probably the highlight of the entire album. There's enough sudden shifts to give you whiplash, but at the same time it never feels like the songs lack cohesion, an issue a lot of similarly wild progressive metal tends to have. Sure, as with any album, it isn't flawless front to back. The 3-song run in the middle doesn't have as many surprises or killer riffs as the rest of the album, but they're still cool tracks all the same. And sure, the album could have been trimmed down to a more manageable size, but I sort of respect how ambitious it is. It's a debut album where the band just straight up goes for broke, and I'd say it worked out spectacularly. And with the title implying a sequel, I'm already waiting excitedly for the day it drops, because with this much potential and talent, I'm sure they'll continue to outdo themselves in the future. But for an album this year that was just as bursting with ideas as Warforged, yet also as emotionally compelling as La Dispute or Trip Sitter, I know I just said that death makes for the most emotionally compelling music, but being personally relatable will always resonate stronger with me regardless. It worked very well for Actor Observer last year, and it worked even better this year for Glass Beach, with their debut that really captures the zeitgeist of millennial angst in a world falling apart around them. And also, it's very, very gay in all the best ways. Happy Wrath Month, by the way.
You said you'll never be okay if you don't come to your senses. With you, everything's the end of the world.
From songs about living with oppressively puritanical parents, to trans rights, baby, to plenty of love songs that actually make me believe the relationship is as important as the songs make it seem. And even a song just about having a stray cat show up in your backyard. Aw, kitty. Like, honestly, there's no way I'll be able to do this album justice in just this short segment, but believe me, it's relatable as heck. And that's before even getting to the sound of the music, which is, well, just very creative and forward-thinking emo. Pretty much every song is doing something different. The multi-part opus of Classic J Dies and Goes to Hell, the bouncy power pop of Bedroom Community, the build and intensity of Cold Weather, the long-form and almost post-hardcore self-titled track, the electronic build of Dallas, the tropical vibe of Yoshi's Island, and the anthemic Orchids closing things off, which I invariably associate with the end of the game To the Moon, which I also highly recommend for the record.
Wanna say I think it's time, yeah, I really don't feel the same way that I feel, like when my love is.
And it's all well executed, and most importantly, maddeningly catchy. Nearly every track is loaded with sticky as hell hooks that make them both accessible and memorable, and it helps that the delivery of the vocals is just powerful, raw and unpolished in just the right ways, as is the production. The musicianship in general is strong across the album too. Every instrument, whether it be the guitar, bass, drums, keys, all of them get their moments to shine, and in general there's a lot of strong instrumental work that keeps the songs very listenable even past the immediacy of the hooks.
One day we'll meet up on the moon and then we'll be okay.
Sure, the mix is a bit blown out in a few spots. Sure, not every song is a killer. Sure, the overall flow is a bit haphazard, but none of those really harm the experience for me. While this isn't quite my favorite album of the year, and it was close for sure, this is the band I'm most rooting for here, as they're a talented young band with great messages, and we're all about elevating LGBT artists here. Using my platform for the greater good, baby. Definitely check this one out if you haven't already. It's easily the most accessible album on this list, and I'd be hard pressed to find someone who can't find at least something to enjoy here. And while 2019 was loaded with great albums, really, there was only ever going to be one album to top my list. One of my favorite albums in years, and that would be... Sometimes I'm up here talking about how much an album means to me, or how emotionally impactful I find it, but sometimes the music is just really damn good. It was the case with my favorite album from last year, and while this album certainly doesn't have much to do with that one stylistically, it still feels like it's cut from the same cloth. For one, the album is just an instrumental blitzkrieg, pretty much front to back. Lots and lots of guitar riffs and leads feeding into each other, a mix of powerful vocals and roaring growls, and an entire woodwind section that gives the song a bit of a jazzy flair. Plenty of songs with a rather high tempo and in your face with barely a moment to catch your breath, while other tracks are more down-tempo and even occasionally hypnotic, with looping guitar lines building to fantastic climaxes. In terms of style, the closest comparison I can make is Protest the Hero, but jazzier, more dissonant, and more aggressive. The use of dissonance might be what draws me in the most here. It's so much more interesting than a lot of similarly technical bands who transpose straight minor key scales over single note chug riffs, and there's much more of an emotional core to it, driven as much by killer riffs as it is by soaring vocal lines. Sure, this album isn't as sonically diverse as Glass Breach or Warforged, but they still take their style in a lot of different directions, while still keeping to a consistent and compelling core sound. The only tiny problem I can even point to here is that the production on the woodwinds is occasionally a little flat, especially compared to how great they sounded on the band's previous album. But speaking of that album, it's also just impressive to me how each and every little issue I had with their debut got corrected with this one. The balance of dissonance and melody is shifted ever so slightly in favor of melody, giving way to more memorable hooks. The songs don't stagnate on ideas quite as long as before, keeping them from running any ideas into the ground, and the overall album flow is just so much stronger here. It's a very complete package, ebbing and flowing in just the right ways to never get overwhelming, but never lose too much of its edge either. I can see this album being a hard sell for many. It's not trying to be particularly accessible, and it's still intense as all hell, but for me personally, I haven't heard an album as exciting as this since, well, let's just say for now that I'll get to that when I eventually make my best albums of the 2010s list. But yeah, a genuine classic, at least for me, and an album I've seen myself revisiting time and time again in the years to come. Keep up the goddamn amazing work, guys.
I've been burning at the
And with that, another year's highlights organized and filed away. I really did feel like 2019 had a lot of great music to offer, even beyond what I was able to cover here. And while 2020 so far isn't quite living up to the same heights, I've still found a lot to enjoy in the half of the year we're already through. I hate being this late to talk about my favorite albums again, but I really wanted to take my time to make sure I had everything in the precise order I was happiest with, and I feel like I did manage to accomplish that here. Anyways, I've rambled on long enough. I'll see you all on whatever I put out next, and take care, y'all.